Thank you very much for a very kind and generous introduction. I'm very happy to be here today. I'm grateful for the opportunity. And thank you, Isabella, for the invitation. Thanks too to Emily for making all of the arrangements. And of course, to all of you for being here at what, as Isabella said, I know is a very busy time of year. I also want to acknowledge that we are meeting on the traditional territories of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples, and within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. Being on these lands entails relationships and responsibilities that should always be front of mind no matter what we're discussing. And among these is the recognition that this has always been a place of teaching, of learning, and of research. And much of what I'm going to talk about today comes out of a paper that I recently completed, but one that, though that bit is complete, remains very much a work in progress. It actually arose out of a minor point I found myself making in a book that I'm close to completing right now called Childhood, Militarism, and Everyday Life. And I cannot tell you how keen I am to see that book finally approaching submission to the publisher, because it is one that has been, or it is one that has been with me for a very long time now, and much longer probably than it should have been. Lots of other projects have been conceived and seen through to completion, but this one has been lingering in the background for literally years. And I've been working on it slowly when I can find the time all along. The result is that it's come together out of a decade and a half of research across a wide range of fieldwork settings that include elementary schools, museums, historic sites, war remembrance observances, performative events like air shows and battle reenactments, amusement parks, playgrounds, and lots more. And what I've been looking at across all of these contexts are the material and performative cultures of militarism that litter children's everyday lives. Not in conflict zones, but in the familiar places of our own social worlds, where children encounter militarism in all sorts of mundane ways that might not attract as much attention. Doesn't catch our notice a lot of the time. And these range from casual encounters in public spaces or with the ambient kind of noise of popular media, to school curricula, extracurricular learning in places like museums, other forms of leisure activity, and lots more. And to get at the deeper implications of what's revealed in all of this, the book makes the case for theorizing childhood not as a time of life, but as a cardinal category of identity and difference, analogous to race or gender and the way we think about those. And so which, like race or gender, is always indispensable to social meaning making. As I said, though, what I want to get at today is more about a recently completed paper than about the book. So why say anything about the book at all? Well, because the paper and the book both came out of the same fieldwork over the course of a number of years. And as I said, the paper itself actually sprang from a minor point that's raised in the book, but that isn't its central focus. And so they are related, though different. But they also share that understanding of childhood that I just described as, again, not a time of life, but a social imaginary like gender or race, which is something that I'll come back to in a little bit. And I also said, though, that the paper remains a work in progress. And that's why I'm keen to talk to all of you about it today and to hear your thoughts around some of these issues. Because what I've come to realize is that what I thought was just going to be a paper actually points to a much bigger project than I had imagined at the outset. And so I think it turns out that it's likely to be the next book project. At least that's where it's headed. So I'm imagining that's where the next book comes from, which means I've got a lot of work and a lot more thinking to do. So let me get to the opening that I'm trying to make that maybe leads to a book that starts with this paper. It begins with a reference to a very famous photograph that won the World Press Photo Prize of the Year for 1966. This isn't it on the slide, but this is the photographer. Sawada also won the World Press Photo Prize in 1965. And that's the earlier 1965 photo that you see on the slide here, showing desperate civilians crossing a river to escape US bombing in Vietnam. And I've included it here because it points to what I mean when I say that childhood does important meaning-making work. Part of what makes this photo so poignant more than 60 years after it was taken is childhood. Seeing young children imperiled like this strikes a particular chord, and it's one that resonates along global moral registers. The dominant social imaginary of childhood, what I and others have taken to calling imagined childhood, so this is a social imaginary distinct from a time of life. This dominant social imaginary frames children as vulnerable, as dependent, but also as politically innocent. And so the image elicits empathy, but it also arouses feelings that make meaning for the larger social context we're seeing. Here, in this case, a humanitarian catastrophe and an unjust war. Now, that's the 1965 photo. I'm going to click through the 1966 photo, which is where my paper begins. I'm going to click through it on the next slide fairly quickly because it has disturbing content. Now, it is very famous. It did win this award, as I said, but it's disturbing. So I'll give you warning now that I'm about to put it up for a moment. And any who might not want to look at it can turn away for a moment. So this is the photo, and that is an M113 armored personnel carrier in Vietnam, dragging the body of a dead Viet Cong fighter to a burial site. It is, as I said, a very famous photo, and it's one that has come to symbolize the shocking brutality of that war. Okay, on to a different image. This is also an M113 armored personnel carrier, this one in use in the Iraq War in 2004. There are no children in this photo, but I think we can imagine how different it might look to us if there were, and how the meaning we might educe from this column of fast-moving military vehicles might be affected in juxtaposition with visible markers of hapless and vulnerable childhood. Say if there were child refugees in the foreground or lining the sides of the road, for instance. This is another M113, but though you could be forgiven for thinking otherwise, this one isn't in a war zone. This one is at an annual carnival-like event east of Toronto called Aquino Tank Weekend. And like similar events held in other places, in Australia, in the US, in the UK, and lots of other places actually beyond those, Tank Weekend is billed as a child and family-friendly event. And besides children watching from the bleachers you see here, watching as battle reenactments are performed, battles that include gun firings, pyrotechnic explosions, uniformed soldiers falling and fallen in mock combat. Besides children watching all of this from the bleachers, there are also lots of other activities open to children in addition to these spectacle performances, including the opportunity to take a ride in a real tank or other military vehicles. Among them, an M113, just like the one in Sawada's brutal photo. But it's the dedicated kids zone area at Tank Weekend that's really caught my attention each time that I have attended, especially in 2023, when this children's play area included another M113. Featured, as you can see, in an area intended for children aged 12 and under. So, here's the puzzle that the paper starts from. What is this military vehicle? One that is in use today in wars in Gaza, in Ukraine, in Sudan, and elsewhere, which is found right now in the arsenals of dozens of other countries. What is this weapon of war doing in the kids' zone? Well, it's there so that children can use it for chalk drawings. Literally overwriting it with a new script that's quite different from the one that we glimpsed from its use in conflict zones, and of course in Sawada's very disturbing 1966 photo. Now, this obviously puts us in mind of the militarization of children's lives. But it's also fair to note that although there are always children at these kinds of events probably are not a widely shared childhood experience. But then, what are we to make of a warplane as the centerpiece of a playground in a public park? A public park that's also intended, there we go, just trying to follow the slides here. A public park that is also intended for children in the same age range as the kids zone at Tank Weekend. This one is in Larson Park in a residential neighborhood in San Francisco. For several decades, it was a real warplane that was repurposed as a play feature here in this playground. But when it fell into disrepair, the commitment to keeping it was still so great that this replica of the real one was commissioned, was built, and installed in its place. Also, it's not a one-off. This is Boyson Park in Anaheim, California, and that is a real warplane. It's been covered in an exterior coating to protect children from injury and also to protect them from lead, asbestos, and other dangerous substances that would otherwise leach from the aircraft that's encased in that coating beneath the protective layer. And as the sign in the foreground says, this playground is also intended for children aged 5 to 12. And note that both the replica plane in Larson Park and the real one in Boyson Park are installed over rubberized playground surfaces as a further measure to make them safe for children. Here's another one, and then I think the point is probably made, though there are lots more actually beyond these also. This is Lions Park in Costa Mesa, another real warplane modified to make it safe for play. And here, the rubberized surface has been designed to resemble the deck of an aircraft carrier. So really doubling down on the theme now. And speaking of aircraft carriers, here's a poster aboard the real World War II and Cold War era aircraft carrier USS Hornet. It's now a floating museum in Alameda, California. You can see at the bottom of that poster that besides veterans, they make specific mention of students and scouts in their mission statement. And quite a lot of the programming that they have on this warship anticipates children of elementary school age. It's not unique. You'll find the same things, including games for children, coloring books, military-themed toys for sale, scavenger hunts aboard ship, on more and all sorts of other kinds of activities specifically for children, on all kinds of other museumized warships and submarines in places all around the world, as well as often on actual active duty naval vessels that do port visits and open to the public from time to time. Beyond these kinds of things, war museums run edutainment programs for children or for scout groups. Some offer day camp experiences on school holidays, as this ad for a school holiday program at historic Fort Lytton in Brisbane, Australia does. Others have programs hosting children's sleepovers or birthday parties in armaments galleries. Birthday parties and sleepovers beside real tanks or under the wings of real warplanes. On the left here, different birthday party themes available for children, and on the right, school holiday activities, both of them at the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa. Note the tank and the self-propelled gun immediately adjacent to the brightly colored children's activities there. If you've ever visited this gallery, you'll know that there are dozens of other tanks and military vehicles of all descriptions completely surrounding that play area. Oh, and a warplane displayed overhead as well. When an M113 is transformed into a canvas for children's chalk drawings, enclosed in a dedicated play area, it takes on a very different meaning from what we see graphically expressed in Sawada's iconic photo, or in cable news dispatches and social media feeds from the war zones of our own contemporary world. In the kids zone, it is, again, literally overwritten with a new social script. And yet, it's not as though no trace at all of its much more grim essence accompanies it into this particular placement in a children's play space. It's also not the case that no hint of the purpose for which it was built accompanies it and the novelty of its use in that unlikely space. Even when we see it in that space being put to that use, we still know it's an instrument of organized political violence. And so it's a much more complex and kind of protean interplay of meanings that's at work here. Now, by itself, any one of these things is an outlier. And so it's important we take care not to overstate the importance of any one of them. Thinking along lines of how children's lives are militarized then, the militarization of childhood, the significance of the tank show or of the plane in the park is in the very small contribution that it makes to the sum of a much larger, what I call in the book, ambient cacophony of militarist ideation, ritual, and performance that in ways that are both varied and idiosyncratic is resonant through shared as well as more particular experiences of all lived childhoods. But when we shift our focus from how children's lives are being militarized by this, that is, shift from the militarization of childhood to what I'm going to talk about as the childing of militarism, now the significance of things like a tank show loom much larger. Events of this sort might not be ubiquitous to childhood, but children are ubiquitous at these and other events like them. Playgrounds and parks, children's birthday parties being held in war museums. These are explicitly child-centered spaces. And what I'm interested in is this normalized presence of children in casual and often lighthearted encounter with weapons of war. Encounters that are visible to everyone in attendance, child and adult alike. And that suggests, I think, deeper social implications. Because here, the danger now lies not in overstating the effect of one particular encounter at the tank show or the park, but in failing to appreciate the subtle meaning-making work that they do toward casting militarism as a benign force, positioning some children as its beneficiaries, even as other children elsewhere have their lives and their life chances imperiled by weapons of the very same sort. Now, obviously, placing a conspicuous piece of war material like an M113 in a children's play area says something about the mundane ways that militarism intersects childhood beyond conflict zones. At the same time, though, it signals something about different and I think perhaps much less intuitive circulations of meaning as the armored personnel carrier, seemingly out of place, gives us a glimpse into how these encounters entail, again, what I want to focus on here, not only the militarization of childhood, but the childing of militarism. Childing, in the sense that I use the term, refers to how norms and dominant ideas about childhood affect what we make of narratives and visual economies of war, as well as the ways militarism more broadly is and can be experienced. So this is, as I say, counterintuitive. An analogy is helpful, analogous to how feminists have urged us to take a gendered perspective, for instance, on war and militarism, and the sorts of insights we can develop by bringing those analytical strategies to thinking about war and militarism. Childing as an analytical strategy means being attentive to how meaning is produced through childhood as a social imaginary, and how it bears on everyday understandings of and our effective and emotional responses to war and war preparation. And this means, again, approaching childhood not as a time of life, but as a constitutive social imaginary that, like gender or race, is always at work producing political meaning in our world. It does it from the local to the global, and not only in contexts where children themselves are present or seem to be directly at issue. And this is how imagined childhood is conceptualized in current contributions, the space that Isabella was talking about, this emerging scholarship at the nexus of critical childhood studies and critical security studies. As an imaginary, it can be understood as a set of essentialized claims that get tied to prescriptions for social practice. So, as vulnerable innocents, for example, children are the quintessential objects of protection. Wars are fought together with rhetorical claims about protecting our children's future. Acts of war by our adversaries are delegitimized, where we can show them to have brought children to harm. The horror of the sinking of a migrant boat, or the withholding of humanitarian aid, the carnage of a drone strike, all of these things are amplified when reports of the death toll are punctuated with the words, including children. And though we do all too often, we needn't actually see their bodies, because the dominant social imaginary of childhood already encodes so much that just the utterance of those words, including children, does this powerful meaning-making work. The idea of childhood innocence, this summons an ethical claim to freedom from political harm. The assumption of children's natural vulnerability demands protection. Incompleteness as an idea, the idea of children's incompleteness vis-a-vis the ostensibly fully formed adult, that necessitates deferment of rights and limits on social participation. And while there is nothing natural or inevitable about this way of conceiving childhood, it's actually very historically recent and culturally specific, even though it's proliferated around the world. Though there's nothing natural or inevitable about it, the political meaning making it does is contingent on this way of seeing it. And so, as Helen Barents captures very succinctly in the quote on the slide, this is from her excellent 2020 piece in the journal International Affairs, imagined childhood does a lot of meaning-making work that is about much more than just children themselves. It scripts how conduct that either helps or harms children is judged, and how we assess those responsible. Not only is childhood a potent political resource, it is also importantly recognized as such by political actors at all scales. National leaders make appeal to it in framing political projects, including the resort to armed force. Soldiers on the ground have to be mindful of it in determining whether the application of force in a given instance might be seen as morally indefensible. And global publics can be counted on to decode political meaning from it in predictable ways in these and other moments. Now, none of that, of course, means that children are not routinely brought to harm in our world. The point, rather, is that there are costs to this, and that even sovereign power has to weigh those costs and then try to navigate them. And in this sense, imagined childhood is a key technology in the governance of armed conflict. So, if imagined childhood can have such consequential political effect that it has to be carefully navigated in armed conflict, even by the most powerful global actors, it stands to reason that this meaning must also have the potential to bear on what we, again, child and adult alike, make of war and militarism writ large in light of children's casual encounters with the everyday traces of war and militarism. Scenes of children playing on tanks in 1945 Berlin, or improvising toys from discarded war material in 1990s Tajikistan, or fashioning a makeshift seesaw from the rubble in Gaza. These images are jarring. And of course, where images like these become visible to us, the wider context in which we see the child is important to how we decode the image. and the situation that's being depicted. And while they might, on some level, strike a hopeful note of, perhaps resilience of children, in general, they have a disquieting quality about them, a sense of lost childhood. A sense of lost childhood that most of us find repugnant and which lends to our moral indictment of those that we deem responsible. So there's a lot at stake in all of this. When the meeting of child and militarism appears neither casual nor incidental, or where it might be clear that the child caught in our gaze is directly imperiled by war, well, then we are much more apt to recoil from militarized practices than to abide, much less celebrate them. And so what we see in this is how the dominant imaginary of childhood, innocent, vulnerable, dependent, how this functions as a key source of the meaning that we ascribe to particular manifestations of militarism and to specific exercises of militarized political violence that we just can't reconcile with this ideal of childhood. And this facility of imagined childhood to affect how armed conflict is assessed along global moral registers is what really interests me here. So, sentimentalized as cherished objects of protection, quintessential innocence, symbolic of desired futures, children are regularly invoked in the rhetorical feints through which the legitimacy of armed conflict is, in some instances, claimed or contested or denied. And as a familiar and inherently political trope, imagined childhood has the power to lend emphasis to the aims of a disarmament campaign, or to underwrite peace negotiations for the claimed sake of children's futures. Images and narratives highlighting children's vulnerability in circumstances of imminent danger or objection. These give moral imperative to calls for us to intervene, right, including military interventions. And just as readily to calls for violent retribution against those that we judge responsible for what we're seeing. It frequently proves, imagined childhood that is, irresistible also as a moral currency in the case of much more dubious political projects, as in Russia's claims that a motive in its war on Ukraine is protection of Ukrainian children. The image on the slide is another very famous one, taken in 1940 in New Westminster, BC, by newspaper photographer Claude Detloff, who actually just caught it by chance as this column of Canadian soldiers was being marched toward their embarkment for war in Europe. But though it just was caught by chance, it struck such a powerful sentimental note when it was first published that it quickly became famous right across the whole of the country. And trading on this, it was made the centerpiece of a campaign to sell war bonds, with the child in the photo, 5-year-old Warren Bernard, being brought to events where he implored audiences to buy war bonds, saying, quote, "So my daddy can come home." Childhood's being traded on by sovereign power there, right, in support of a war effort. This photo remains iconic to this day in Canadian war remembrance. It appears in school curricula. It has been featured on coins and postage stamps as recently as a decade ago. A 4-meter high enlargement stands at the entrance to the main gallery of the Canadian War Museum. And on the spot where Detloff took his photo in 1940, a bronze sculpture has stood since 2014. This particular figuration of childhood has done a lot of important meaning-making work in Canada for close to a century now. And that tells us something about how invested we are in it. It's also revealing of the reliability of imagined childhood and the encoded meaning that it brings to this and other framings of war. As well, it's exemplary of the childing of militarism in the sense that it's really a bit too on the nose, isn't it? In its explicit deployment, and I use deployment on purpose here, its explicit deployment of imagined childhood as a way to cast militarism as a benevolent force. And that's really underscored by things like what I mentioned a moment ago, peacetime stamps and coins, and all the other ways that the image continues to recur more than 80 years after the war that was its original context came to an end. And this brings me back to the puzzle of imagined childhood in kid zones and war zones. Again, most children's lived experience does not include play on abandoned tanks in conflict zones, and most won't find a decommissioned warplane in their public park, repurposed as playground equipment, though neither of those things is as uncommon as we might hope. What these kinds of things contribute to our understanding of militarism's imbrication with lived childhoods then lies in their everydayness more than in their particulars. The point is that across all life worlds, analogous kinds of encounters are part of children's everyday lives in myriad ways, some of them shared and some of them quite unique. But if those that we occasionally witness in the dispatches from conflict zones, if those ones register for us as unnatural or abhorrent, what should we make of a warplane as a playground feature, or museums, whole war museums, hosting children's birthday parties in comparatively safe spaces far from the fraught places of the conflict zone? In some contexts, it seems, children's everyday encounters with militarism puts us very much ill at ease. But in others, they're largely prosaic and normalized to the point that they usually seem to inspire little to no critical reflection at all, and indeed might escape notice altogether. The significance of this disjuncture between what has a disturbing quality for us in one context, whilst elsewhere just receding into the mundane, that distinction is more than just academic. It points to an aspect of imagined childhood that is due much greater attention, namely the nuanced and pervasive ways that it functions as a social technology of governance at all scales of social life, including in the governance of war and war preparation. War preparation. Well, inseparable from war itself are war preparation, that is the ceaseless process of military recruitment, as well as the progressive refinement, building, and maintenance of the implements of war and all that's requisite to their use. And then there's militarism, the ideational and cultural practices that continuously reaffirm the application of organized political violence as a necessary, normal, and natural means to responding to political problems. War preparation is the broad sphere in which we might be first inclined to think about the longer run implication of the militarization of children's lives. And indeed, in this sense, important currents of scholarship and activism are concerned not only with forms of early recruitment through things like junior cadet programs, which in some countries, including our own, enroll pre-adolescent children in close or direct association in some cases with the regular military, but concerned also with the inculcation of valorized militarist values at a very young age that might later in life then affect a predisposition to look favorably upon enlistment. But if militarism can make social meaning for children in the ways that it valorizes martial values, and given what we've come to understand about imagined childhood as also an important source of social meaning making, what then might childhood mean for militarism? Which is a very different question. If, as I've been suggesting, the social meaning of imagined childhood can have such consequential political effects that it has to be carefully and deftly navigated as part of the practice of armed conflict, even by the most powerful global actors, it stands to reason, it seems, that this meaning must also have the potential to bear on what we, child and adult alike, make of war and militarism writ large in light of children's casual encounters with, again, the traces of those things in our everyday lives. And that recommends bringing the same kinds of critical childhood-informed analytical strategy that we take to the conflict zone to sites of children's everyday encounters with mundane militarism in places far from the conflict zone, in these places. Imagined childhood is at work in these less overtly troubled places too. Though here its role in the production of social scripts is less about political maneuvers in war than it is about scripting about war. Kevin McSorley asks us to be attentive to how war relies on a wide range of embodiments, as he puts it, from exhilaration to mutilation, different ways in which we embody war. For the child in the conflict zone, both the reality and the always present possibility of mutilation, that's probably the most pressing and dire embodiment of war. But when we turn to war's embodiments at the air show or at the battle reenactment, performances from which the threat of mutilation has been dissimulated, right? It's not experienced there. The embodied experience is one of exhilaration, the other thing that McSorley points to. Even when they might be short of exhilarating, everyday encounters with material cultures of war are always embodied. In a large urban park in Cairo, for example, children are attracted to a tank that's been installed there as a climbable play feature. And for those who pretend that they're able to operate it, here war simulation isn't in awe-inspiring spectacle like at the tank show, but it's in the imaginative play of children themselves. In places as far separated as Brisbane, Australia, and Orangeville, Ontario, for school children who make spontaneous use of a field gun that's sitting in their local parkette, simply to gather together, neither war nor its simulation seem particularly palpable. And there's a more nonchalant kind of embodiment of that encounter with militarism. These incidental kinds of encounters seem to speak more to the imminence of militarism than of war per se. And that points to McSorley's important observation on the slide about the potency of the banal. On the one hand, these are the guns I was talking about. I didn't take the pictures when the kids were sitting because one doesn't do that. On the one hand, these mundane sites of embodiment of militarism are germane to understanding the militarization of children's lives. But when we think instead about the childing of militarism, it's necessary to think also about the gaze of all of us, of all who encounter children encountering militarism. That's to say, we need to think and ask not only about the social meaning that we derive from a visual field without children, a visual field in which militarism is captured, but also about the kinds of meaning that arise from a visual field in which we encounter encodings of militarism and imagined childhood together. The pictures I couldn't take because you don't take pictures of other people's children. To better illustrate this, it's helpful to think again about imagined childhood and the governance of armed conflict, but now in direct connection with what McSorley raised about embodiment. Inasmuch as the threat of mutilation is at once a personal embodiment of war, right? For children in the conflict zone, it's a way they are embodying war when they are mutilated, but also an exigency in the governance of armed conflict that can come to discipline the conduct of those who would target them. What we're really talking about is the political meaning making that children's embodiments of war produce for the spectator. That's clear where the mutilated bodies of children or the targeting of a school bus in a drone attack, where these things function to delegitimize particular exercises of political violence by igniting spectator outrage. That's what they do. Somewhat less tangible, but no less important, I would suggest, are the calculations that might preclude an airstrike in the first place, because the anticipated political costs of those imagined mutilated bodies outweighs the tactical considerations. But here again, children's embodiments of war end up affecting the range and weight of political possibility for other subjects. And they do so from the standpoint of those subjects' own gaze. And that last point is a crucial one. That is, children's embodiments of war, when they come under the gaze of other subjects, they produce new embodiments of war by those subjects. When we encounter children encountering war and militarism, that is one of the moments of our embodiment of war and militarism, because it's part of the visual field that we're taking in. Because imagined childhood is generative of particular kinds of social meaning, images and narratives of children's suffering affect how other subjects embody their own encounters with that suffering and its broader circumstances. The spectator embodies war again as their own encounter with its visible horror and then reacts accordingly. So that's the horror of war. Returning again to the mundane spaces of playgrounds and birthday party venues, a long way from the sites where war's most dire consequences play out, the visibility of children's everyday encounters with militarism is also still part of how it is that the embodied spectator subject encounters these things. Like the M113 in the kids zone, performative events like air shows and tank shows, these things dissimulate the reality of violence from weapons of war, but they do it without ever fully concealing it. In the tank arena, mock battles are fought both to educate and to entertain. And the embodiment of that militarism as exhilaration is the shared experience of child and adult attendees. But the presence of children and the efforts exerted to attract children's attendance by making these highly militarized spaces children's spaces is visible in is meaning productive in other ways that are visible at the same time. Conceiving particular spaces as places of children's belonging right away imbues them with meaning that bears on how those spaces are perceived, how they're regulated, and how they're engaged. And making explicit militarized places amenable to the presence of children is then, to some meaningful extent, to make them children's spaces with all of the wider social meaning that that entails. So by way of wrapping up, let me get to some of the fundamental implications of this. First, means that making things like military air shows or battle reenactments hospitable to easy coexistence with childhood constitutes those practices in ways that draw important constituents of their substantive content from all the deferred meaning bound up in imagined childhood. Put more succinctly, making an M113 the canvas for children's chalk drawings has the effect of domesticating the weapon. And there's something going on here that is reminiscent of, some of you might be familiar with Carol Cohn's very important piece that she wrote some decades ago now on her tour of a US Navy ballistic missile submarine, during which those on the tour were invited to pat the missile. She wrote a paper out of this. Patting the missile, as she said, is something usually reserved to babies or small children for that which is harmless. Pat the missile, she said, and its lethality disappears. Note how imagined childhood is at work in her analysis there, in the reference to babies and small children to make her point. It's at work in the same way in the kids zone, where we witness children drawing with chalk on the M113, or in the playground where the warplane is the play structure. While the dissimulation of real violence from weapons of war doesn't cause us to lose sight of their intended purpose, it does manage the relations of encounter by making them safe for the spectator in a way that they are not for those in the war zone. Mock battles, made more realistic by pyrotechnic gunfire. These things make all the sights and sounds of the real battlefield feel present in simulation, right? There's the roar of tank engines, the smell of diesel exhaust. You feel the percussive sensation of the explosions taking place in the show. You feel it in your chest. You see the uniformed reenactors falling and fallen in the mock battle. And all of this is viewed by crowds of spectators from the bleachers, safe behind a containment fence, many wearing earplugs that are handed out to protect them from the noise, protect their hearing from the noise. And then after that, after the performance, the fallen rise, the crowds disperse and go and enjoy the other activities, including play in the kids' zone. Far from being forgotten then, the violent purpose of the weapons is very much on display, right? It's foregrounded in the spectacle performance. They don't just show the weapons, they try to show them in context. They try to make it real. But at the same time, it's contained in a way that affirms its relationship to everyone in attendance, who, whether exhilarated or maybe some moved to lament the human cost of war, regardless, no one in attendance needs fear this. And that particular way of embodying war as fear is notably absent in all of these contexts. Without it, the weapon's intended purpose can remain visible, but the tank or warplane or armored personnel carrier itself is domesticated. And so building from Cohen's important insight on the meaning-making dimension of patting the missile, we can understand all these things as performing the very same function. If the lethality of the missile is mystified in the invitation to pat it, something similar is at work in inviting children to make chalk drawings on an armored personnel carrier, to play on a warplane, or to spend the night on a battleship. These encounters also frame relationships to war and militarism. But this is the important point I want to end at. Not just for children. Imagined childhood produces meaning for others in these settings also, including adults, just as it does in Cohen's reference to babies and children as small, cute, and harmless, and thus more appropriate to patting than a missile. The visible presence of children in these and similar contexts makes meaning of the weapons and reaffirms their relationships to particular political communities. Free from fear, some children make lighthearted fun or casually improvise use of these instruments of war that others elsewhere have to fear. And in so doing, these children, in their visible presence, become part of a new script legible to other spectators as they fall under their gaze through the prism of imagined childhood. Something as mundane as the sight of children playing on the warplane in the playground or gathering to sit on a field gun in a local park mystifies the lethality of these artifacts, as well as the lethal intent that brought them into the world in the first place. More broadly, reading these places as children's spaces casts militarism as a benevolent force, even in encounter with the very instruments of its violent excess. Whereas images of children suffering in situations of armed conflict, where those may limit the practical ability to exercise militarized violence because of the blowback it will cause when it ignites outrage, here, childhood actually has a palliating effect for militarism. Making militarism safe for children makes it safe for us all. And these are some of the things that we start to glimpse by taking a childhood-informed approach, again, analogous to a gender-informed approach, to analysis of the social worlds that we share, and of the always political meaning-making work that makes them possible. That is what I'm trying to get at in this project.
Thank you, Marshall, for such an insightful talk and for making the things that are so well hidden visible.